Hold on. I'm going to the timer. Okay. Everybody, a guten Erev Shabbos. Fantastic to be learning with you on a Friday. We have a single daf, a single page to do today because we have caught up. We're on the schedule. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Friday? Sharon in New Jersey, Gordo in Scotland. Always great to see you live on Fridays. Renee in Indiana, Nancy in North Carolina, Karen in Northern California, Andrea in Northern California, Shandora, excuse me, in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, John in Maine. Thank you so much, John, for stepping up and supporting AT as we're about to bring our AT app to market. We are really depleted, folks, so it's our annual campaign. It's primarily funding the AT app and the release of it right now, as well as our payroll, our assistant, everybody. Keep the lights burning at AT. We need your help. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Where am I? Guy in Ohio, Pauline in Chicagoland, Marjorie in Virginia. Great to have you all with us. Just two very quick things. First of all, I want to apologize. I was just so infuriated yesterday when I heard about this, people on social media, young people being all, moved by Osama bin Laden's letter to America. And I referred to young people who are in that camp as morons. I think that's not a correct way for me to speak, and I apologize for that. As a matter of fact, being taken in by propaganda, even the propaganda and ravings of a madman, is certainly not limited to the purview of people who are literally, mentally challenged, intelligence challenged, shall we say. Some brilliant people get taken in by all kinds of ideologies. But at any rate, let's keep sharing light. Let's keep sharing the truth. And, the truth has a way always of floating to the top, and eventually people see, even if they're fooled for a time. Secondly, I'd just like to dedicate our learning today to the hostages, bring them home. In our minyan, we read every day, many minyans, I think most minyans around the world, most synagogues around the world are adding psalms to their services at the end of morning prayers, afternoon and evening prayers. And so one of the typical psalms that we'll say, it's very short, Psalm 121. So our learning today, and this Psalm 21, for the sake of the hostages, may they come home soon, may they be free, and may peace prevail, a secure peace prevail over the Holy Land, and lives will be saved. A song of ascents. I shall raise my eyes to the mountains. From where will my help come? My help is from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to falter. Your guardian will not slumber. Behold, the guardian of Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your guardian. The Lord is your shadow. He is by your right hand. By day the sun will not smite you, nor the moon at night. The Lord will guard you from all evil. He will guard your soul. The Lord will guard your going out and your coming in from now and to eternity. And we say amen. Okay, page 15. We're starting at the bottom of 14b. But it's Tes Vav. Page 15 is our daf today. Picking this up near the bottom of 14b, we are now discussing Mishna number 3 here in chapter 1 of Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. Generally speaking, the law of damages. When you injure another party, how much do you have to pay? What kind of damage was it? From what part of your assets will you be required to pay, if any? What is the difference between a restitution and a fine or a penalty, right? We're going to get into that today because it's very different. The one who does the damage has to pay. But it's interesting that the same amount of money could be characterized as either restitution for what the injured party lost when his animal was injured or killed, or it could be characterized as a penalty. And even though the money might be the same, because they're characterized differently under certain circumstances, it can produce a different result, as we shall see. So near the bottom of 14b. The Mishnah continues before a court, right? So this Mishnah number 3 was a very short Mishnah. And it said basically that if you're going to have to pay damages, so that assessment is made before a court, right? Before a rabbinic court, some kind of a court. It's not done between private parties. I mean, they can agree to make each other whole. But if there's going to be litigation, right? In other words, that the defendant doesn't want to pay, so he's brought before a court. Okay, so then the court is going to make the assessment. We're not just going to take the word for it of the injured party in terms of how much damage was sustained. He's going to have to show that in the court. So the Mishnah continues, before a court. What does this phrase mean? The phrase should be understood as a qualification of the previous phrase in the Mishnah that teaches, as the Gemara explained at the end of yesterday, that a court collects damages only from land. The Mishnah then teaches that the court collects only from the land that is still in the possession of the one liable for the damage when he appears in court. And this excludes a case where the one liable for the damage sells his property, that is land, and afterwards he goes to court. Since at the time of the hearing he no longer owns the land, the court does not collect damages from it. But the Gemara challenges this. Should we conclude from the Mishnah that if one borrows money and then he sells his land, and afterward he goes to court, then the court does not collect the loan from those who bought the land from him? This is certainly incorrect, as the creditor has a lien on the debtor's real property from the time that he borrows the money. And as we've discussed a bunch of times, a lien means that if Reuven lends money to Shimon and he says, okay, I have a lien on your land if you don't pay me back. And so Shimon then doesn't pay back the loan, and the land that he has, he sold to Levi. And then, the money that he gets from that selling the land, he goes to Vegas and drinks and gambles it away. Now Shimon has nothing Does Reuben have recourse? Yeah, because Reuben had a lien on that land. So even though Shimon sold it to Levi and Levi paid for it properly, Reuben can now go seize that land from Levi. Levi needed to be on notice. He had to know that there could be a lien on land that he bought from Shimon. Now, he might have extracted a guarantee from Shimon that if Shimon's creditor came and seized the land, Levi would have recourse. He certainly has recourse against Shimon, but Reuben can go get that land from Levi, right? So we know that a lien stays with the land even when it is sold. And now you're saying that if somebody had a piece of land and he sold it before he was brought to court or he gave it away, that then he's exempt from having the court seize his land for damages. But we know that the court can seize, or that the creditor can seize that land. So what's going on here? So rather, the phrase before a court should be understood as an independent clause that excludes a court of non-ordained judges. What we're talking about is a proper court, right? If you're going to assess damages, make an appraisal, you need a sophisticated court, right? There can be a Beis Din, right? Like a small rabbinic court made of just laymen, kind of like the educated people in the community, as opposed to, and now we're talking about in the ancient world, as opposed to the big rabbis, right? Ordained rabbis who were, understood to be the sages. In other words, you need people who are at the level of the sages or the students of sages in order to have that kind of a court that can assess and extract property. Now, the Mishnah continues, payment is made based upon the testimony of witnesses. And the Gemara explains this clause is stated to exclude from liability one who admits he is liable to pay a fine, even if witnesses come afterward and testify that he is liable to pay it. And the Mishnah teaches that he is nevertheless exempt due to his admission. And this actually is the halacha, right? That's interesting. So, for example, if you steal somebody else's property, and then you either get caught or you decide to atone, right? So you're gonna return what you stole. Are you done when you returned what you stole? No, you're not, right? So first of all, when you steal something and then you want to make good on it, you have to give back, what you took, and not just like what's left of it, because maybe while it was in your possession, it got trashed. You have to make it good up to the value of what you took. And then on top of that, there is this fine, right? This penalty. In some cases, it's 20%. In some cases, it's 100%. In some cases, when you steal a sheep or a cow, it's a big multiple of what you took, right? If you took a sheep and then slaughter it, I think you owe 4 sheep. And if you took a cow and slaughter that, you owe 5, or vice versa. So there's this big penalty. But what's interesting here is if you admit that you owe the fine, then you're exempt from paying the fine. And the Gemara asks, well, this works out well according to the one who says one who admits he is liable to pay a fine is exempt, even if witnesses come afterward and testify to his liability. But according to the opinion that says, with regard to one who admits he is liable to pay a fine, and then witnesses come afterward and testify that he is guilty, then he is liable to pay the fine. So what is there to say in explanation of this clause of the Mishnah according to that view? And the Gemara answers, the clause does not serve to exclude some other case. Rather, it is needed to preface the latter clause of our Mishnah that teaches that the only people who are accepted as witnesses in cases of damages are both free men and members of the covenant, meaning Jews and not Canaanite slaves. And the Mishnah states free men to exclude Canaanite slaves from being valid witnesses, and it states members of the covenant to exclude Gentiles, right? Now, this is in a rabbinic court. Now, a theme that you can see running through this is that, the Torah doesn't speak to every situation, right? The Torah is famously terse. And there's a lot that's not included. And that's why the sages of the generations issued decrees to sort of help us obey the Torah laws in areas that the Torah, just didn't speak about explicitly. Some of those oral laws were actually given to Moses at Mount Sinai, but many, many, many were developed by the sages over time. Now, we always make a distinction between laws that are doraisa, right, that are written in the written Torah, and that are distinguish those from the laws that are derabanan, right, from the rabbis. And the difference, of course, is that in a case of doubt, we're stringent for the Torah law and we're lenient with respect to a rabbinic decree. But when it comes to, we're always thinking, and it's actually the first mitzvah, the first Noahide law that is incumbent on all of humanity. We always want to seek justice. We always want to pursue justice. We want to make justice, right? So it's always possible to have the laws of the kingdom. A king can issue laws, that are going to be beyond what is the scope of the Torah and rabbinically, which is just what we have to do in order to be righteous and live a righteous life. But the Torah is not going to address every situation, right? And so we see, over time, for example, the U.S. code, just adds laws and laws and laws. There's just so many thousands of laws. It can kind of get unwieldy and ridiculous. And it's because over time, society decides that it wants to address certain principles, for the sake of justice or for the sake of policy, for the sake of the economy, whatever it is. But at any rate, the rabbis are going to be very careful not to over-legislate. Even though they draw a fence around the Torah, they're not going to issue laws that people aren't going to follow, for example. And they're not going to issue laws for situations that are unusual, which is a great principle that, I went to law school and I remember them saying, tough cases make bad law, right? Because sometimes you have a real emotional case, but it's a very unusual situation. You end up creating a law to address that case. And the unintended consequence is that in the more typical situations, it produces more injustice than justice. So you have to be careful what situations. And the bottom line is there's going to be cases where we would say, well, somebody damaged another person. Like, why aren't they going to be liable? Or their property damaged the property of another person. Why aren't they going to be liable? And it's because it's outside the scope of what the Torah was mandating. Damages get paid. It's not that every situation where damages might get paid, it gets paid. Some situations not, I think I've shared before, we made a movie. We're working our way through post-production, working on music right now. We had a terrible thing that during production, we had a crew member that embezzled funds from us. It was a disaster. We had to raise more money. It was really we recovered. Okay, we're going to be okay. The movie's going to be okay. But it was devastating. And, and so, the LAPD is investigating and hopefully charges will be brought. But the production doesn't have money to hire a fancy, civil litigator who's going to go and do all the forensic accounting and sue this person who may or may not have assets. And so even though it's unfair, and even though this guy in, Los Angeles where the prosecutors are not overzealous, shall we say, even though this guy might get away with it, it's totally unfair, but at the end of the day, we're going to be like, okay, well, this is just one case where we're not going to get justice. I don't know if we're ever going to get justice. I don't know if there's going to be restitution from the thief back to our production, and then happens. Like, it's not every situation is going to be made right in a court of law. We can't always count on courts of law to make situations right. Sometimes it's just, call it bad luck or call it, God's plan includes that not everything is made right. Maybe it'll be, we'll see later that it would all fit into God's plan. But while we're in this world, not every injustice is made right. It's just something to keep in mind. Okay, now the Gemara notes, and it is necessary to teach both exceptions, right? That in terms of, when we're talking about Torah ordained damages, which are specific cases, and that they're going to be only assessed in a court, right? A court of properly ordained judges, qualified judges. And if a fine has to be paid based for these damage, along with these damages, the witnesses cannot be non-Jews or Canaanite slaves. Right, and so the Gemara notes that the Torah had to mention both, right? You could have just said, well, all it had to say was non-Jews. Why do you have to mention Canaanite slaves? That's a subset of non-Jews. So says the Gemara, it is necessary to teach both exceptions, as had the Torah taught us only about a slave, I might have presumed that he is disqualified from serving as a witness in one of these damage cases because he has no lineage, i.e. the child of a Canaanite slave is not legally considered to be his child in any sense. But a free Gentile who has lineage, I might say no, he is qualified. And similarly, had the Torah taught us only about a Gentile, I might have presumed that he is disqualified from serving as a witness because he has no connection to the commandments of the Torah that apply to Jews, and it's those commandments that are now being used to dictate whether damages are paid or not. But with regard to a Canaanite slave who does have a connection to the mitzvahs, as he is obligated to keep the mitzvahs that a woman is obligated to keep, I might say, no, he is qualified. Therefore, it is necessary to teach both exceptions. So the Mishnah continues, and women are included in the laws of damages in the same way as men. And the Gemara asks, from where is this matter derived? And the Gemara presents three sources for this law. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, and similarly the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, the verse states with regard to the liability of one who takes a false oath that he had not stolen, when a man or woman shall commit any of the sins of a person, Numbers 5:6, and the verse equates a woman with a man with regard to all punishments in the Torah. So the school of Rabbi Lazar taught the verse states with regard to the civil laws given following the revelation at Mount Sinai, Exodus 21:1, and these are the civil laws, hamishpatim. Right, that term mishpatim here is being translated as the civil laws that you shall set before them. The reference to them in the verse is referring to all those who stood at the revelation, both men and women. And the verse thereby equates a woman with a man with regard to all civil laws in the Torah. Now, the school of Chizkiah and Rabbi Yosei HaGalili taught, the verse states with regard to liability in a case where one's ox kills a person, Exodus 21:29, and it killed a man or a woman. And the verse thereby equates a woman with a man with regard to all killings in the Torah, i.e. the liability incurred is the same whether the person killed was a man or a woman. So the Gemara notes, and all three sources are necessary, as had the Torah taught us only the first source, one might have said that it is there that men and women are equated, as the merciful one had pity upon a woman and made her liable in order that she should achieve atonement through paying restitution. But with regard to civil law, one might say that for a man who is involved in business dealings, yes, the civil laws apply to him, but to a woman who generally is not involved in business dealings, the laws do not apply. And had the Torah taught us only that men and women are equated in civil law, one might have said that this is in order that she should be able to sustain herself by engaging in business dealings. If civil laws did not apply to a woman, one would be wary about conducting business with her. But with regard to obligating a woman to achieve atonement, one might have said that a man who is obligated in many more mitzvahs than a woman is obligated, yes, he is obligated to achieve atonement. But a woman who is not obligated in so many mitzvahs like a man is, no, the obligation does not apply to her. And had the Torah taught us only these first two sources, one might have limited the fact that a woman and a man are equated to these two cases. Here, due to the fact that she also needs atonement, and there, due to the fact that she needs to be able to sustain herself. But with regard to a person's liability for his ox killing another person, one might have said that only for killing a man who is obligated in all the mitzvahs, yes, the owner of the ox is liable to pay a ransom, but for killing a woman who is not obligated in all the mitzvahs, one might say he is not liable. And had the Torah taught us only the equivalence of man and woman with regard to a ransom, one might have thought that this is because it is a very serious matter. because there is loss of life. But in those other two sources where there is not a loss of life, you might say, no, a woman is not included. Accordingly, since you would be wrong to have any of these thoughts, the Torah had to include all three examples to teach us that men and women are equated, are equal before Torah law in these three different areas. So the Mishnah continues, and both the injured party, now back to our Mishnah about damages before a court, and both the injured party and the one liable for the damage are involved in the payment. So what does it mean, involved in the payment? So there was a dispute between the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, that was stated with regard to the payment of half the cost of the damage made when one's innocuous ox gores another person's animal, right? So going back to our first Mishnah in tractate Bava Kamma, there were four kinds of damage, right? The ox, fire, pit, and man, right? If we go by that view of Rav, man doing direct damage to another person. So when we talked about the ox, there's three kinds of damage. There's goring, there's eating and trampling. Eating and trampling, so if your ox tramples over the property of somebody else in the public domain, or eats the property of someone else in the public domain, so they're going to have to pay the full damages for that. But if your ox gores another person's ox, so then it's different, right? So we've seen, and we've discussed this a bunch of times, that there is the difference between the innocuous ox and the forewarned ox. Meaning, if your ox has gored another ox with its horns, has, charged at another ox and injured another ox multiple times, so now you know that your ox is a dangerous ox. And so if your ox then does it again, you're going to have a higher degree of liability. You're going to have to pay all of the damages sustained by the person that your ox gored because it's a forewarned ox. Meaning you are forewarned about your ox. You know it has that tendency to be dangerous. Whereas if your ox hasn't behaved that way, and then it does it. Okay, so that's called an innocuous ox. You had no reason; it wasn't foreseeable that your ox would become dangerous. You had no evidence of that in the past. So in the case of the innocuous ox, you're only liable to pay half the damages. Now, what's so interesting is, what does it mean that you're paying half the damages? Are you making restitution to make the injured person whole? But the Torah limits your debt, as it were, in this situation, limits your liability to half of the damages because your ox was innocuous. But what you're doing by paying half those damages is giving restitution. It's just half as much as the injured party would have liked. Or is the amount is measured, the amount of the damages that you pay is half of what the injured party actually suffered, the physical damage to the injured party. That's the amount of it. But perhaps the payment that you're making is not restitution. It's actually a fine. Let's see. They are both involved. Where did it go? Yes, and both the injured party and the one liable for the damage are involved in the payment. And this dispute came up between the Amoraim with regard to the payment of half the cost of the damage made when an innocuous ox gores another person's animal. Rav Papa says it is monetary restitution for the injured party's loss, but Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, says it is a fine. And let's see what is the practical difference. Now, the Gemara elucidates. Rav Papa says the payment is monetary restitution, as he holds that even ordinary oxen, which have not been forewarned with regard to goring, are not presumed to be safeguarded, as their nature does not prevent them from acting in a belligerent manner. Therefore, the owner is responsible to safeguard them to prevent them from doing so. Accordingly, if an ox causes damage by goring, well, by right, it should have been that the owner needs to pay the full cost of the damage. Nevertheless, the merciful one had pity upon him, as his ox had not been forewarned, right? His ox had not shown this belligerent tendency in the past, and so the owner was not fully aware of the possibility that it might gore, and accordingly the Torah reduced the extent of his liability. That's Rav Papa's view, that you pay half the damages, but what you're doing is making restitution. Normally you should have had to pay the whole thing because your ox gored somebody else's ox, but because your ox didn't show that tendency in the past, you only have to pay half. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, says, no, this is a fine, as he holds that ordinary oxen are presumed to be safeguarded, as their nature prevents them from acting in a belligerent manner. Therefore, the owner is not responsible for safeguarding them to prevent them from doing so. Accordingly, if an ox causes damage by goring, by right it should have been that the owner does not pay at all. Nevertheless, the merciful one penalized him in order that he will safeguard his ox even before it is forewarned, and decreed that the fine should be given to the injured party, even though he is not really entitled to be compensated for his loss. Right? Isn't that interesting? According to Rav Huna, okay, so Reuven's ox, got a bee bit it, something very unexpected, and then it gored Shimon's ox, okay? And Shimon's ox was either injured or maybe even killed. Now, why should Shimon collect damages from Reuven? Okay, the ox that it happened to belonged to Reuven. But really what happened was a freak occurrence, a bee bit an ox, the ox kind of went nuts, and Shimon ended up with the loss. Why should Reuven have to make him good on that? You see? Now, once you start to say, at first it sounds like, well, obviously Reuven should pay. Reuven's ox damaged Shimon's ox. But, maybe Reuven was exercising a perfectly, appropriate level of care in guarding his ox. He wasn't doing anything wrong. His ox got bit by a bee that day, and it went at Shimon's ox. Right? And so we see that the merciful one creates, what seems to be a pretty good solution, half the damages. But in paying half the damages, is it merely that he's excused from paying the full damages, because after all it is his ox, or is it that a fine is being imposed to just put everyone on notice? Listen, if your ox hurts somebody else's, even though it's innocuous, you're going to have to pay. So go out of your way to have a little extra caution to make sure your ox doesn't hurt somebody else's. Now, we learned in the Mishnah, both the injured party and the one liable for the damage are involved in the payment. So granted, according to the one who says that the payment of half the cost of the damage means monetary restitution, you only have to pay half, but the half that you're paying is for the purpose of making the injured party whole. So this assumes that the injured party is theoretically entitled to receive the full value of his damaged animal, but in practice receives only half. So this is what the Mishnah means by saying that the injured party is also involved in the payment, because it is as though he is compelled to forego half of the cost of the damage that by right he should be paid. Somebody else's ox, and we know whose ox damaged your ox. Okay, so you should get a whole payment, but the Torah says you only get half. Okay, so then you can say that the victim, the owner of the injured ox is involved in the payment. But according to Rav Huna's view, that when the half damages is paid, it's actually a fine, it's a penalty. So in what way is the owner of the injured ox involved in the payment? By rights, he should have got nothing. It was just a freak occurrence, and he shouldn't get anything from Reuven. Now that Reuven has to pay half the cost of the damages as a fine, how do you square this with the Mishnah's requirement that that both parties are involved in the payment, both the owner of the damaging ox and the owner of the injured ox? But according to the one who says that the payment of half the cost of the damage is a fine, which assumes that the injured party is not really entitled to be compensated for his loss, now that even the money that he takes is not his by right, is it accurate to describe him as being involved in the payment? So the Gemara explains the Mishnah's statement is necessary only with regard to the fact that the injured party is the one who absorbs the loss, due to the diminishing value of the carcass between the animal's death and the time the case is brought before the court. Since he must absorb this financial loss, it may be said that he is involved in the payment. Now, the Gemara asked, how can one claim that the Mishnah is referring to the diminishing value of the carcass? Isn't it already taught in the first clause of the Mishnah, which by using the term payments for restitution for damage, teaches that the owner of the injured animal attends to, meaning retains ownership of, the animal carcass, and therefore it follows that he bears any depreciation in its value, as the Gemara explained above on page 10b. So the Gemara explains why the Mishnah needs to teach this principle twice. One mention is made with regard to an innocuous ox, and the other one is made with regard to a forewarned ox. And it is necessary to teach both cases, because if it would teach us the principle only with regard to an innocuous ox, I might say that only there does the Torah limit the liability of the owner of the ox, because it has not yet been forewarned. But with regard to a forewarned ox, I would say the Torah does not limit the owner's liability at all, and the owner must also bear the loss due to the diminishing value of the carcass. And similarly, if it would teach us the principle only with regard to a forewarned ox, I might say that only there does the Torah limit the owner's liability, because he is paying the full cost of the damage. So the Torah does not overly burden him. But with regard to an innocuous ox, where he's liable only for half the damage, I would say that the Torah does not limit his liability any further, so he must bear the loss of the diminishing value of the carcass. Therefore, it is necessary to state the principle in both cases. Now, the Gemara attempts to prove whether the payment of half the cost of the damage is considered to be monetary restitution, per the opinion of Rav Papa, or a fine, per the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua. Come in here a proof from a Mishnah on page 16b that we'll encounter tomorrow night, God willing. What is the difference between the liability incurred for damage caused by an innocuous ox and that caused by a forewarned ox? The difference is that the owner of an innocuous ox pays half the cost of the damage exclusively from the proceeds of the sale of its body. And the owner of a forewarned ox pays the full cost of the damage from his superior quality land. That's a big difference, right? That's a big difference. Not just that the amount that he has to pay is different, but where we're going to go to get those funds is very different. Right? Because the ox that gored, maybe the ox that gored was a, old rickety three-legged ox that wasn't really worth very much money. And the one that and this old rickety ox gored a prize bull, right? That would have been worth tremendous money, who knows, in the bullfighting ring in Spain. And so, if you say that an innocuous ox, he only pays half the restitution, but the place to get that money is only through the sale of the goring ox, in this case, that old rickety three-legged ox. Whereas if it was a forewarned ox, if this three-legged old rickety ox had a history of goring other oxen, then when it gores this prize bull that's worth millions of dollars in the ring, in Madrid, so now you can go not just to sell the rickety old ox, you can go and, collect the actual damages from the land that the owner of the old rickety ox has. That's a very big difference. Now, the Gemara explains the challenge posed by the Mishnah. And if it is so, that payment for damage caused by an innocuous ox is considered a fine, right? It's half the damages, but even though it's only half, it's a fine, not half of a restitution payment. If it is so, then let the Mishnah also teach this additional distinction. The owner of an innocuous ox does not pay based on his own admission, in accordance with the law that one does not pay a fine based on one's own admission. Whereas the owner of a forewarned ox pays based on his own admission, because it's not a fine, because it's restitution. Now, the Gemara answers the Tana could have taught this distinction. However, he taught only certain distinctions and omitted others, including this one. Just because this distinction wasn't mentioned in the Mishnah doesn't mean that it's not, that the Tana doesn't hold by it. So the Gemara asks, what else did he omit? That he omitted this. A Tana would never omit just a single case. Perforce there must be another law that he omitted. And the Gemara answers he omitted the law that if an innocuous ox kills someone, its owner does not pay even half of the ransom payment, whereas if the ox is forewarned, he pays the full ransom. Now, a ransom is different than the restitution for damages, right? Restitution of the physical damage. A ransom, this is only in the case of an ox and only in the case that the victim dies, right? This ransom is a special payment. Sounds like that is definitely a penalty, but maybe not. Ransom is its own category. Now the Gemara answers the Tana ransom. Now the Gemara rejects this. If one claims that the Mishnah omits the law of one who admits his liability due to the fact that it also omits the law that the owner of an innocuous ox does not pay even half of the ransom, well, that is a flawed claim, as this is not an omission. Because one could say, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, who says that when an innocuous ox kills a person, one pays half the ransom. And therefore, the distinction between an innocuous ox and a forewarned ox is included in the Mishnah's ruling that the owner of an innocuous ox pays half the cost of the damage. Accordingly, no proof can be adduced from the Mishnah. So the Gemara suggests a different proof. Common here, a proof from a Mishnah, Tractate Kesuvos, page 41a. Now we're on 15b. If one admits my ox killed so-and-so, or my ox killed so-and-so's ox, then this person pays based on his own admission. And the Gemara analyzes the Mishnah. What? Is the law of the Mishnah not stated with regard to an innocuous ox? If so, this Mishnah proves that one is required to pay for half of the cost of the damage, even based on one's own admission, which demonstrates that the payment is a monetary restitution, not a fine. So the Gemara rejects that proof. No, the law of the Mishnah is stated with regard to a forewarned ox. And the Gemara asks, but according to this explanation, if it had been an innocuous ox that gored, what would be the law? What would one say that indeed he does not pay based on his own admission? But if so, rather than teaching in the latter clause of the Mishnah in Tractate Kesuvos, if one admits my ox killed so-and-so's Canaanite slave, he does not pay based on his own admission. So let the Mishnah differentiate and teach the distinction with regard to the case raised in the first clause itself. The reason for the distinction between the cases when one's ox kills a Jew or a Canaanite slave is that in the first, one pays monetary restitution, while in the second, one pays a fine. If the Mishnah wishes to demonstrate the difference between a fine and monetary restitution with regard to whether the defendant admitted it that he owes this money or not, then instead of introducing a new case, the Mishnah would have modified the case of the previous clause. The Mishnah would have continued. In what case is this statement in the first clause said? It is said with regard to a forewarned ox, but with regard to an admission that one's innocuous ox gored, he does not pay based on his own admission. The fact that the Mishnah does not say this suggests that in fact one is required to pay for half the cost of the damage based on one's own admission that his innocuous ox gored. Evidently, the payment is therefore considered to be monetary restitution and not a fine. You might argue that, but the Gemara answers no. The reason the Mishnah did not raise the distinction between an innocuous ox and a forewarned ox is not because that distinction is not a valid one, but rather because the entire Mishnah speaks only of cases of a forewarned ox. Accordingly, no proof can be adduced from the Mishnah. So the Gemara suggests a different approach. Come in here a proof from the concluding clause of the Mishnah you just cited from Kesuvos. This is the principle. Anyone who pays more than the cost of that which he damaged does not pay based on his own admission. And the Gemara infers, what? Is it not that were he liable to pay less than the cost of that which he damaged, he would pay based on his own admission, since when an innocuous ox gores, its owner is liable to pay more than the cost of the damage. Since when an innocuous ox gores, its owner is liable to pay more than the cost of the damage, the payment is clearly not monetary restitution. Perforce it must be a fine, and therefore it is not payable based on one's own admission. I mean, if it's an innocuous ox, you pay less than the actual damage. I don't know why it says more. Might be a typo, or maybe I'm misunderstanding. Now, the Gemara rejects the inference. No, one should infer only that were he liable to pay as much as the cost of that which he damaged, he pays based on his own admission. If the sum to be paid is more or less than the cost of that which he damaged, he would not pay based on his own admission. In other words, when the damage, the liability that is assessed is not equal to the physical damage, either it's more or it's less, we're going to consider that amount as being some kind of a Torah mandated fine rather than restitution, because it doesn't match the amount of the physical damage. Only when it matches the physical damage do we call it restitution. If it's any other amount, whether more or less than the actual damages, we're going to call that a fine. So the Gemara asks, but according to that opinion, where one is liable to pay less than the cost of the damage, what would be the law? Would one say that indeed he does not pay based on his own? And when you're paying a fine, if you admit that you owe it, you're exempt from paying it. Whereas when it comes to restitution, if you admit that you owe it, you still have to pay it. So if so, instead of teaching this is the principle, anyone who pays more than the cost of that which he damaged does not pay based on his own admission, maybe that Mishna should have taught instead, this is the principle. Anyone who does not pay as much as the cost of that which he damaged does not pay based on his own admission. As that statement indicates, cases where one is liable to pay more than the cost of that which he damaged, and it also indicates cases where one is liable to pay less than the cost of that which he damaged. Evidently, the Mishnah holds that where one's liability is for less than the cost of the damage, it is payable based on one's own admission. This, therefore, provides a conclusive refutation of the opinion that payment for half of the cost of the damage in the case of the innocuous ox is a fine, right? According to, if we're reading that Mishnah Kesubos correctly, if you're paying less than the damage, it's not a fine, it must be restitution. But you're going to see that, but that's not what we said. The other view, at least, was if it's any amount other than the actual damages, it is a fine. Only when it's the actual damage do we consider it restitution. And the Gemara adds, and the law is that the payment for half the cost of the damage is a fine, right? Because it doesn't match the actual damage, it's considered a Torah mandated fine rather than restitution. And the Gemara notes the obvious inconsistency, but you just said that this was a conclusive refutation of the opinion that payment for less than the full fine, in this case half the fine, that it is, you're saying that if it's less than half, if it's half the actual damages, then it is considered not a fine. It is restitution. And now you're saying that it is a fine. Which is it? And so the Gemara explains, yes, the law may be in accordance with that opinion because of the following resolution of the refutation, right? Sometimes the Mishnah says, or the Gemara says, this is a refutation of a certain argument. In that conversation, it was a refutation, but maybe somewhere else they came to a different conclusion. That's why we always say the Talmud is vast, and we don't paskin halacha from the Gemara, because even it comes to a certain conclusion in one area of the Talmud, it might come to a different conclusion elsewhere, and that's why we have Shulchan Aruch, right? A compilation of the actual halachas, so we know where the law ended up after the various discussions of a particular law that took place in different tractates. Right. So what is the reason that the Gemara held there is a conclusive refutation of the opinion that the payment for half of the cost of the damage is a fine? Because the Mishnah does not teach anyone who does not pay as much as the cost of that which he damaged does not pay based on his own admission. This is not, in fact, a conclusive refutation. As even if one holds that payment of half the cost of the damage for an innocuous ox is considered monetary restitution, one can still explain why the Mishnah doesn't discuss cases where one is liable for less than the cost of the damage. And this is because the Tana cannot make an absolute statement about such cases, that one never pays based on one's own admission, since there is an obligation for one to pay for half the cost of the damage resulting from pebbles inadvertently propelled by the foot of a walking animal, which through tradition it is learned that this payment is monetary restitution. And it is due to that reason that the Mishnah does not teach cases where one's liability is valued at less than the cost of the damage. Right? This is another example having to do with an ox where the ox damages somebody else's property and the owner of the ox is only liable to pay half of the damage. It's not the case of an innocuous ox that gores. It's the case of an ox that is walking through an area and it doesn't trample somebody else's property, but it kicks up a bunch of pebbles that do damage to somebody else's property. So there's a kind of in-between step. The foot of the ox didn't actually damage somebody's property directly, but the pebbles that it kicked up did that damage. And so we have a tradition that was an oral tradition given to Moses at Mount Sinai that for that situation we pay half and not the full amount of damages. So the Gemara considers the ramifications of this law. And now that you have said that the law is that the payment of half the cost of the damage is a fine with regard to the innocuous ox, so now let's look at other innocuous animals. Right? So with regard to this innocuous dog that ate lambs, or this innocuous cat that ate a chicken, which is atypical behavior for dogs and chickens, we do not collect a payment for these acts in the courts in Babylonia, since it is not common for dogs to eat lambs and cats to eat chickens. These acts are classified as goring, irrespective of the fact that the animal gained pleasure from the damage. Right? The ox, when it gores, it's not doing that to satisfy its hunger. But when a dog eats a lamb or a cat eats a chicken, it is doing it to satisfy its hunger. Nevertheless, we consider these to be in the category of goring because it's atypical for a cat to eat a chicken. So therefore, we don't say to the owner of the cat, you should have known that your cat might have eaten that other person's chicken and made sure that your cat didn't get out of the house. We don't say that because it's unexpected. It's not foreseeable. Therefore, in cases where these animals had not performed this act of damaging before and were therefore considered innocuous, the owner is liable for only half the cost of the damage, and we discuss this liability as a fine, not restitution. Since the collection of fines may be imposed only by judges who have been ordained, and ordination is given only in Eretz Yisrael, these payments are not collected in Babylonia. Harkening back to what I said earlier, right, that just because damage was done, and we might come up with theories of who should pay, it doesn't mean that there's going to be, a mechanism for transfer of damages and, in every situation. Sometimes you're just out of luck, right? And the laws in the Torah don't cover every situation. And as we see, these kind of damages are only going to be paid if they're brought before a proper court with ordained judges in the land of Israel. And I would say that I don't know that they would be talking about in the land of Israel today when they're talking about in the land of Israel back then. In the land of Israel, when the land of Israel is governed by Torah law, which you can't say today, right? That today we have the state of Israel, which is a secular government. There's obviously many incredible rabbis and rabbinic courts in Israel. Do we still make this distinction today about whether damages for an innocuous dog are paid in Eretz Yisrael and not outside of Eretz Yisrael? I don't know. But that was a distinction that they made at the time of the Gemara. Now the Gemara adds, and this matter applies only where they attack large animals, as it is atypical for them, right? It's atypical for a dog, for a chihuahua to eat a lamb. It's atypical for a little cat, to eat a big chicken. That is atypical. But where they attack small animals, well, that's different, right? It's not so unforeseeable that if you leave your pit bull around an 8-day-old lamb, that the pit bull might have dinner. It's not so unforeseeable that if your full-grown cat is around a little, day-old chick, that, the cat might eat dinner. So that's different, right? That is foreseeable, and for that kind of damage, we would consider the cat or the dog to be forewarned, like a forewarned ox. Or like any ox when it comes to eating or trampling, that we know that that's a typical manner of oxen to walk or to eat. So the owner is considered on notice and pays full damages. And for the case of a cat eating a little chick or a dog eating a little lamb, they are considered forewarned, and those damages would be collected even outside of Eretz Yisrael. And even in a case where the payment is considered a fine, if the injured party seized the property of the owner of the belligerent animal in order to cover his loss, we do not reclaim it from him since he is entitled to it. And also, that's a whole other wrinkle to this, right? So a court only gets involved to seize real property. But between the two parties, if the injured party has the ability to seize, money or movable property of the other party to make good his loss, especially if they agree to that, great, then justice was done. The court didn't have to get involved. And also the injured party said to the court, fix a time for me to go to Eretz Yisrael to present the case before ordained judges. So then we fix a time for him, and he goes to Eretz Yisrael at the time, and we tell the defendant to go with him. And if he does not go, we excommunicate him for disobeying the orders of the court. And either way, we excommunicate the owner of the belligerent animal until he removes the danger. For example, by killing the animal or otherwise neutralizing the danger. Now, this is much more in keeping with, what we would expect to happen in terms of policy to run society. Right? Whether or not damages are paid by the owner of a goring ox, of a forewarned ox, maybe he has property, maybe he doesn't. But anybody who's maintaining a hazardous situation, the judges, the sages of his community will say to him, hey, what are you doing? You can't have that dangerous situation, right? You can't keep a bazooka on your porch where anybody could come along and take it and, shoot somebody else with the bazooka. Like, if you have a dangerous situation, it's on you to end that dangerous situation. And if you're so negligent or recalcitrant that you won't do it, then the leaders of the community will excommunicate you, which is a very intense punishment because nobody else in the community will talk to you or do business with you until you remedy the situation. And the justification for this is from the ruling of Rabbi Nassan. As it is taught in Baraisa, Rabbi Nassan says, from where is it derived that one may not raise a vicious dog in his house, and one may not set up an unstable ladder in his house? The verse states, Deuteronomy 22:8, you shall not bring blood into your house. I.e., one may not allow a hazardous situation or item to remain in one's house. As long as the belligerent dog or cat is still alive, the owner is in violation of this verse, and therefore the court may excommunicate him for failing to remove the danger. More than we care, whether the one person whose ox was gored gets made whole by damages or a fine. I mean, we care about that. We certainly want justice to be done. But even more, we want to make sure that this belligerent ox isn't going to still be in a situation to keep doing that harm. Okay, that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 1. Now I'm going to quickly read Mishnah number 4 and then take a couple questions. Mishnah number 4 of chapter 1. There are 5 it's already an hour we've been going. I'll just start with the Mishnah tomorrow night. That would be probably a better use of time. So tomorrow we'll start with Mishnah number 4, especially since Shabbos ends so early now. It won't be so bad. We should be able to get on the air by I think last week we got on by 7:15. So that should be a good guess for tomorrow night, 7:15 Pacific. Okay. Let me see a couple of questions on Bava, Kamma 15. Wouldn't the recipient of a fine be to the court and restitution to the injured party? No, not necessarily. I don't think so. In fact, they're saying that we would characterize payment of half the damages, which is definitely made to the owner of the injured animal, and still we call it a fine. So it's, in English we might use that language, right? That restitution, especially in a criminal case, restitution is to the victim and the fine is to some government agency. But here what the distinction they're making is restitution for damages versus a fine that the Torah imposes. Likewise, right, one who steals a sheep and slaughters it, and then he has to, replace with 4 sheep, he doesn't pay those 4 sheep to the court. He pays them to the victim. There's a few other questions. Joe, isn't this considered today as hiding one's assets to prevent loss of money? Right, so you're talking about earlier, we mentioned that one who, just gets rid of his land before he goes to court, and then the court doesn't have what to seize. I think that that's what it sounds like, right? And then maybe you hide it that way, dispose of the asset with some friendly party who's going to give it back to you later. That's fraud. That's definitely fraud. And it's not that the sages would ever countenance fraud, so I feel like there's more to that we didn't really get into because we were moving fast. Sharon is saying with regard to the word mishpatim, which here was translated as civil laws, mishpatim are generally considered civil laws. Chukim are the religious obligations and rules. Particularly when we say chukim, we're talking about the laws that there's not a logical reason for them, like the red heifer. In the evening service, the prayer Ahavas Olam references and thereby distinguishes them to instruct us Torah u'mitzvahs, right? Torah and mitzvahs, hukim and mishpatim, otana limadata. Pardon my bad transliteration, but we're just thanking God, praising God for teaching us, right? By elevating us, by giving us these laws to live by, right? Both the civil laws that help us to create a just society, and the religious laws that elevate us spiritually. Bill, so what I'm wondering about is Rav Huna's comment on the ox being by its nature safeguarded. In English, that would make sense. An ox in English is exclusively a bull that has been gelded, which makes them less aggressive. But as I recall, ox in Hebrew is more of a species, correct? And this is ignoring the fact that, for obvious reasons, no bovine owned by a Jew is ever going to be an ox in the English sense. Not that the Torah has anything to say about it, because we don't castrate our male animals. So what in the nature of a large bovine is Rav Huna seeing that would make them inherently safe? So first of all, right, they were disagreeing on that. So the idea would be that, well, it is the way of oxen to cause damage, so they are inherently in need of safeguarding, which seems to be Rav Papa's view. You're saying, but Rav Huna says, no, if we're just talking about the innocuous ox as opposed to the goring ox, and what he's saying is, well, what he means is that it only becomes a goring ox after it has gored several times. So until then, it's an innocuous ox, right? And so if it's an innocuous ox, and that is the vast majority of oxen are innocuous, so what level of safeguarding are we really responsible for? Obviously, some level. but not enough that when an accident happens, you would be considered, well, you owned an ox, that it could damage others, and you didn't prevent that from happening. Boom, it's on you. And I think that's what Rav Huna is saying, that no, you, as long as you're taking normal care like anybody would, that you're not considered to have failed to safeguard your ox from committing that goring in the case of the innocuous one. I think that's what he's saying. And finally, Karen, is it that the ox is accustomed to the yoke? I was sure oxen were a different species also. I looked it up and was surprised to find that it's the same species. And I guess we start to call it an ox when its career is to pull the wagon or the plow. And otherwise, it's cattle if we're just keeping it for eating. I don't know enough. I don't know enough to understand that terminology. But that's what I've got for us today. Please God, may we hear good news. Please God, bring them home. And please God, restore peace as soon as possible, a safe and secure peace that will save lives throughout the region. And not just throughout the Holy Land, but everywhere. I mean, Jews really are in danger everywhere in the world. And please God, may we all be safe. Good Shabbos.